Hello and welcome to First Look, a Bible study looking ahead to the reading or readings for the coming Sunday. My name's Carl and it's good to have you with us. This week we're back in John's Gospel and grappling with a very famous passage in which Jesus declares himself to be the Good Shepherd. But before we begin looking at all of this, if you haven't done so already, you might find it helpful to download the sheet that accompanies this study, the link for which is just below the video in YouTube. On the sheet, you will find the passage that we're going to be looking at, some questions that we will ponder together later on, some other texts that you might like to look up, and plenty of space for you to record your own thoughts and observations. So without further ado, let's dive into today's reading, which comes from John's Gospel, chapter 10, verses 11 to 18. We have to step back quite a bit in the story of John's Gospel to get a real sense of what's going on here. We learn at the end of chapter 8, verse 59, that Jesus had left the temple in Jerusalem with his disciples and was heading back out across the Jordan to where John was originally baptizing, John the Baptist. We find that out in chapter 10, verse 40. And if we go all the way back to chapter 1, verse 28, we find that being described as Bethany beyond the Jordan. So in other words, Jesus and the disciples are on the move. They're heading out into the Judean countryside. But in chapter 9, Jesus had come across a man who had been blind from birth, and he chose to heal him, even though it was on the Sabbath. We learn that in verses 1 to 12. The Pharisees were deeply angry as a result of what Jesus had done, and they approach the man's parents because they don't really believe Jesus has healed him and that he was indeed blind from birth. And then they tackle the man himself, eventually deciding to eject him from the synagogue and pronouncing the same judgment on him that Jesus had declared was not true. The man was not born into sin. He hadn't been a sinner all his days in the way that they described. Yet that's what was said when he was ejected. In verses 35 to 41 of chapter 9, Jesus had sought out this man that he'd healed, and some Pharisees overheard him as he talked about enabling those who were blind to see and making those who claim to see blind. And so the setting when we dive into chapter 10 is still very much one of conflict, one of confrontation, in which Jesus' status as God's Son and as Israel's Messiah and as the Son of Man continues to be questioned. As we'll see, it's a chapter that begins with a parable and moves into various attempts to explain that to the Pharisees who don't really understand what Jesus is trying to say. So thus in this reading we have Jesus and the disciples travelling away from Jerusalem towards Bethany beyond the Jordan. We've got the man who was healed in John chapter 9, who's still on the scene, and we've got the Pharisees. Now, it's important to remember that the Judaism of Jesus' day was very lively and there were lots of different groups. The Pharisees were just one of those groups that had an influential role in Israel's religious life. And they were people who, it seems, were very angry with Jesus and afraid of what he was trying to do, as John depicts it. And we learn in chapter 8, verse 59, that they'd wanted to attack Jesus. And that in chapter 10, verse 39, they wanted to arrest him. So Jesus is very much seen as a threat. And the way that that is depicted may have something to do with the context in which John's Gospel was written. It was the last Gospel to be written around 90 to 95 of the Common Era, and at a time when there was a real parting of the ways between Christianity and Judaism, and Christians were being ejected from synagogues. So this era of confrontation might well reflect the context in which the author of this Gospel was writing. If we're going to make sense of it, it's helpful to keep in mind a particular Old Testament text, which is chapter 34 of the book of Ezekiel. It may not be a chapter with which many of you are familiar, but it's a chapter which talks about the ideal king as being like a shepherd, modelled on King David, who was a shepherd boy before being anointed by God and eventually becoming the greatest king of Israel. And it's a chapter in which there's lots of talk of God being the shepherd who brings the people of Israel into the fold and cares for them, unlike false shepherds, hired hands who abandon the sheep. And so it's very telling imagery that underpins a lot of what Jesus is saying, and indeed some of the bold claims that he's making in this passage. If we want to fully understand it, we have to get our heads round a bit of how shepherding worked in the Middle East, which is different to how it's tended to work in Western traditions. Shepherds in that context were able to call each sheep individually by name and have the sheep come to them. Indeed, a former Bishop of Durham, Tom Wright, describes seeing this happen. The shepherds were so heavily invested in their sheep that they would spend the majority of their time with them, and that's how they'd know them so well, their individual quirks and habits and likes and dislikes. And the sheep in turn would recognise their shepherd's voice as distinct from other human beings. The sheep would also be able to be moved around in a way that's rather different to what we might think of from a Western tradition when we think of a shepherd, in that a sheepdog wouldn't be needed to keep them in control, as it were, and they wouldn't be driven on from behind, but rather they'd be led from the front by their shepherd, who could trust that the sheep would follow. They would follow the shepherd's voice. So that imagery is very much what Jesus is working with in chapter 10. We learn in verse 6 of that chapter that Jesus had begun the chapter, and he continued his response to the Pharisees with a parable, and that's what we have in verses 1 to 5. But the Pharisees struggled to understand what he was trying to say, and so there are 3 different explanations that Jesus offers. Firstly, in verses 7 to 10, secondly, in verses 11 to 18, which is our passage for today, and then latterly in verses 25 to 30. And so what we're looking at is Jesus' second go at an explanation. Now our passage begins with one of the most famous of the I am sayings that we find in John's Gospel. It begins with Jesus declaring himself to be the Good Shepherd. But the word that's translated as good in verses 11 and 14 could be rendered, perfectly reasonably, as beautiful, which is not about Jesus' good looks, but it's referring to the attractiveness of his ministry, those things that drew people to him, like the man that he'd healed in chapter 9. But it could also be translated as noble, leaning towards Greek ideas of a noble warrior's death. And indeed, one commentary that I looked at very much framed the whole passage as being a kind of description of a noble death that would have made sense to Greek readers of John's Gospel. And I think there's an argument for that. And I'll explain why when we kind of come towards the end of this little study, and why it resonates, what's here, with some of the key features you'd expect to see in a Greek death narrative of that kind. Regardless of whether that is reasonably the case, however, I think what we can definitely say is that the definition of a true shepherd, a good shepherd, is that they're not someone who's just in it for their own profit and who, when danger comes, will abandon the sheep and run away. Jesus was therefore very unlike the hired hand that he talks about, who had no obligation to protect the sheep from the wolves. That was the owner's job, and would run away and leave them to their fate. This use of shepherding imagery and kind of sacrificial imagery as well picks up on an Old Testament theme which connected the ruler and their people with a degree of intimacy like that of shepherd and sheep. So we're very clearly in the territory of Ezekiel 34. And we're told in verses 14 and 15 of this passage that the intimacy between father and son is the very model of the intimacy that we see between sheep and shepherd. So there's a profound connection there between the intimacy, as you might now say, at the heart of the Trinity, and the intimacy that's possible between God and God's people through Jesus Christ, the Good Shepherd. We see at the end of verse 11 and at the end of verse 15, Jesus talking about laying his life down for the sheep. And this points to his vocation as someone who was one with God and who was Israel's Messiah and the Son of Man. And it shows the extent of God's costly love in a context that, remember, there was about conflict and confrontation, and in which the Pharisees were already trying to arrest Jesus and already were willing to attack him if the opportunity arose. So it reveals the depth of God's love, but not just for the people of Israel, for the original sheep of the fold, as it were, but for those other sheep, not of that fold, not of the people of Israel, that Jesus was looking to bring in too. And so we see here a sense of his messiahship being something that encompasses but goes beyond Israel to bring in the Gentiles too. One of the reasons this is a useful passage for us to keep in mind in this Easter season is that we're journeying towards Pentecost and the real launch of that mission to the Gentiles. So the Messiah is the shepherd to sheep of all nations. And as I said, what we have here is very much the love between father and son being revealed in the laying down of Jesus' life for the sheep. Voluntarily, it's a death that's freely embraced. As Jesus says, no one could force him to do this. It's his decision to lay down his life. And it's something he'll be able to take up again at the resurrection. Now that was an immensely bold claim to make, partly because it was moving beyond the Jewish idea of a general resurrection to something being claimed for an individual person. But it was very much equating Jesus with the actions and the character of Yahweh, Israel's God. And I think Jesus is very much in this, exerting his divine status in different ways from different angles. It's an expression in what he does of the Father's love for all creation. That's kind of the fundamental here. And we can certainly draw out various aspects of this little section, of this explanation of Jesus' parable, that relate to this Greek rhetorical pattern of a noble death. So, for example, in verses 11 to 14, we know that it's a courageous death on behalf of others, a death that doesn't shy away from danger, but stays with the sheep even in the midst of that. It's a death in which the justice of duty is fulfilled to the sheep that are known. We find that in verses 14 and 15. And indeed, it's a death that shows the cost of the intimacy that God desires with all creation. It's a death, as we learn in verses 15 and 16, which is fundamentally motivated by love and, as we see in verse 18, obedience as well. And importantly, in this framework, it's a death that's embraced entirely voluntarily, and yet it isn't, as we see in verse 17, the end of the story. So you can see why some have seen this as being about a kind of noble death in those Hellenistic terms. But behind the imagery very much does lie the Hebrew scriptures and Ezekiel 34, in which both God and the Messiah are shown as the true shepherd of Israel. So Jesus is claiming both messianic status and divine status. And the two weren't necessarily seen as the same, so Jesus is bringing them together. And we see that most fully if we were to read on in chapter 10, in verse 30, when Jesus declares that he and the Father are one. So I hope you find that helpful, and that as you explore the questions, you're able to see more of what it means to declare that Jesus is the Good Shepherd, and how that imagery might make sense for us today, when many of us might be a degree or two removed, shall we say, from sheep and shepherding.